Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare, the great love tragedy. William Shakespeare was born roughly about 23 April 1564 and died 23 April 1616, commonly known as the Bard, probably one of the greatest English playwrights to have ever existed. Even now, we still read his plays as a part of normal English literature. One of the things that makes William Shakespeare so great is how he's able to roll a lot of meaning into the words that he uses. Wanted to talk a little bit about him first before we actually get into the story of Romeo and Juliet, probably one of the greatest love stories ever written, and definitely William Shakespeare's most popular. William Shakespeare is accredited to have written 38 plays. Some of them include Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth, and the one we're going to be taking a look at today, Romeo and Juliet. I would love to go through each and every play, but as some of them aren't going to necessarily kind of be applicable for what we're looking to do, I do want to actually take a look at some of the ones that we've listed here, in addition to other ones that I just didn't have the space to put up on the screen. In addition, I would like to go over some of the sonnets that he wrote, as well as take a look at the longer narrative poems and maybe some of the minor poems. But these are over the course of so many years that he was able to be so prolific in his writing, but he was also able to cement himself as one of the greatest playwrights the world has ever known. One of the ways that we can understand this is that the fact is that over 400 years later, we are still reading his stories. We are still able to glean information. And one of the reasons this is because it was so early that there is such a fundamental nature and a guiding nature of his writing that impacts our reading and our writing today. Think about it like this. If we understand William Shakespeare as the foundation on which English writing has come about, we can see how we have developed and grown over the course of time. Now, there is an argument to be said in that William Shakespeare, when he was writing it, the understanding of the English language was so much richer than we have today, that because of time and because of how the language has developed, there's actually been a thinning of understanding, and there is less understanding as far as how we understand the words and how they can play on our emotions and how deep some of the ways that we used to talk as compared to now. I kind of attribute this more to slang and whatnot, where we're actually thinning out the words and we're removing the robustness of some of these words. And this is something that could happen for any number of reasons. But I've heard arguments to say that for the English, it's when we introduce specific Norman words or French words into the language that there's actually a thinning out of it, where the Saxon original language was actually quite deep and quite robust. But that's for people who are a lot smarter than me to debate. But now that we've gone over a little bit about William Shakespeare, let's get into the actual story. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Here we're starting off in Act 2, Scene 2. We're not actually going to be talking necessarily about earlier, but we're talking about, in this case, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks. The imagery here that's being portrayed is that we're seeing Juliet as the sun. While this is stated specifically, what is the sun in regards to somebody who is lost? The sun is something, there's a redemptive, there's a hope, there is a joy that comes when somebody has gone through a period of darkness in their life. The sun is the imagery that we use to help us show that there is more to the darkness. There is a hope. There is a light that we are able to maybe not necessarily find in ourselves, but we're able to use and truly see what's going on. One of the ideas that darkness creates is actually kind of a duality. Not only are we not able to see what's going on around us, we're not able to see truth, but it also has a depressive effect on us, that we are at the mercy of what's going on around us. I've mentioned this in a previous video, but when we're talking about a sun, we're talking about how it is exposing the darkness and getting rid of that unknown, that is what Juliet is. She's life, she's light to Romeo, and the window is just the east. It is just the area from which the sun comes from. Now, these are all how I am understanding these phrases. Of course, there are people who have been studying Shakespeare who will go into a lot more detail, or who have their own idea about how these words are actually meaning for what they were actually spoken for at the time. But these are just some of the ways that I think we could benefit from looking at these lines that could help us write better and more condensed and more powerful phrases and dialogue. O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name. Or if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. For those that don't understand what's going on, is that the Montagues and the Capulets have been a warring faction in this town for some time. Italy is actually known for being very about the intrigues and the very feuds that are going on between houses. So this is the start which we're talking about when we're talking about the two star-crossed lovers. It's the fact that their houses are in a state of conflict, and that what's shown on a little later on and earlier on than this case is that because of the youth of the young men that are engaged in this warfare, that there is a passion that is misplaced, that the hate that goes to both sides is particularly strong when it comes to the younger members of the families. For the older members of the family, yes, but you don't necessarily see that same passion. But when we have two people who are in love, when she says, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? What she's actually saying is why are you Romeo? Why are you a Montague? Why are you my enemy? The person that I have fallen in love with so fast. Why are you this enemy that I cannot just go and love like I desire, like my heart has pushed me towards? But she is not necessarily unwilling to give up everything that she has. When we're talking about refuse thy name, or when she's talking about I will no longer be a Capulet, we're not necessarily talking about forgetting and, moving on. But when we're talking about from the context of Shakespeare's time, we're talking about family is everything, and not just in a, familiar, go to dinner and, eat, but rather if you don't have anybody, and it's not even just women, but also men, if you don't have a backing, somebody to hold your back or watch your back in some cases, you are at great risk of being destroyed. There is no sense of honor when it comes to this particular time as we understand it today. A lot of power comes from the many. If you have people on your side, you have power. If you don't have anybody on your side, you have no power. And those that don't have power are always going to be at the mercy of those who do. This is something that is not understood unless you take a look at the historical context. So when she's saying here is that deny your father and refuse thy name, or if you won't, be sworn by my love and I'll no longer be either. What's she saying? She's saying that I will give up everything that I have, every safety, just because I love you. That is the imagery that Shakespeare's talking about here, that we're talking about a love that is beyond just a lust, or beyond just a, hey, I like that person, but rather I will give up everything that I have just to love you. Now, of course, we can take a look at it from the context of somebody who is not yet 14, star-crossed young lovers who don't understand the reality of what they're doing. And there is a aspect of the tragedy here where we're talking about somebody who doesn't understand reality, and they allow their passions to come and take over for the type of life that they are going to lead. Passions are the undoing of people if they are not harnessed correctly. That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. This is the next part of this, where we're talking about, she's saying that the names don't matter. Those things that we hold on to, they don't matter. They don't matter because it is the natural essence of who that thing is, of what that thing is, that matters. By any other name would smell as sweet. A rose, the name that we are assigning to the rose, does that have an effect on the actual scent, that intrinsic value, that the intrinsic element that makes up the rose, that scent? Just because we label it rose, that doesn't have anything to do with the actual scent of the flower. This is an idea that we are talking about. We're pulling apart the idea of who that person is, the name, and how valuable that name is, but at the same time saying that it doesn't matter. It doesn't have anything to do with the type of person that you actually are. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I were the glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. Here we're given an imagery of somebody who literally his sole desire is to be able to touch her. Not in necessarily a vulgar way or a necessarily sexual way, but so that there's a closeness, where there is a closeness of proximity, but also something a little bit more intimate. You know, when we're talking about a glove upon the cheek, we're talking about as close as possible without necessarily becoming vulgar. We're talking about subtle, just wanting to be near each other, that type of love. Oh, swear not by the moon, the inconsistent moon, that monthly changes in her circle orb, lest that they prove likewise variable. Here are two things that I wanted to point out when we're talking about the moon. The moon is something that's inconsistent. Yes, there is variations when we're talking about the sun, but the sun in comparison to the moon is steadfast. Yes, we understand that the sun will shift. Really, it's how the earth shifts around it. But because the moon is not necessarily seen as a consistent force, that it changes, that the moon has phases. And I find that interesting, where she actually says in her circle orb, where she's actually applying a feminine aspect to it. And there's a level that you think about it, you know, when it comes to hormone cycles, how women have a monthly cycle as opposed to men, which tend to be more 24-hour. It makes a lot of sense if you look at it from that perspective, but it is something that we can keep in mind when we're talking about inconsistency. Not to say that every woman is inconsistent or anything like that, but what Shakespeare is saying is that I don't want something that's inconsistent. I don't want something that is variable. I want something that is the same, that is nothing that changes. Don't swear by it is something that we're talking about. Hey, I don't want even a hint of possibility that there could be a change. Don't swear by the moon because it is consistent. Because by swearing on something, you are accepting a part of that into the swear, lest that thy love prove likewise variable. This bud of love, by summer's ripening breath, may prove a beauteous flower when next we meet. Here we're talking about that a bud of love. We're talking about something that's not ripe. We're talking about something that's tiny but has the ability to become beautiful when we're talking about a development of their relationship, not just something that is something they want to keep tiny and small and don't change, but rather growing in the experience of each other's love and having that grow into a beautiful flower. That's the imagery that Shakespeare's talking about here. We're talking about how this is seen from not just Romeo's perspective, but also as us as readers, is that we're talking about a beautiful picture of love by not actually discussing love as like we would normally say, you know, the pulse quickened or something like that, but rather we're using other words. By summer's ripening breath may prove a beauteous flower when next we meet. Talking about absence makes the heart grow fonder. These are ideas that is being put into the story itself. Here we're getting somebody who's a little bit different, Friar Lawrence, the old wise man who is outside of that conflict, who's seeing it for the horror that it is, wisely and slow. They stumble that run fast. The idea here is that the passion that we talked about earlier will undo people if they go too fast, if they are unwise about how they go about their duty or go about their life. That passion makes us speed up, makes us not think about what we have to do. This passion is not just necessarily something about love, but also hate, as we see with other characters in the story. We see a passion, a hate passion that ends up becoming that person's undoing, where it actually causes a lot of the suffering later on. That in his own death, this character actually destroys Romeo and Juliet because of what ends up happening. And it's not just this character, but also Romeo. The passion of his revenge overtakes him, not thinking about the consequences of what he has to do. And he ends up killing a family member of Juliet, which gets him banished. These are all things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about passion and how it plays out and how we have to be acting responsibly and thinking and acting slowly and wisely. These are all things that we can keep in mind when we're talking about passion. For this alliance may so happy prove to turn your household's rancor to pure love. Here is a hope from Friar Lawrence, where he's talking about what can defeat that hate, that rancor, that scourge. When we're talking about rancor, we're talking about depravity or sourness or rotting. That's what they're talking about here when they're talking about rancor. It's like a rottingness that is eating the souls of both households. Love is one of those things that purifies people, that makes them less selfish. That's what's going on here, is when he's talking about turn your household's rancor to pure love. Where he's hoping that with this relationship, this love, this fire, pure hot love, can burn away that hate and anger so that they can give up this fighting, this feud that's been going on for so long. That's what Friar Lawrence is getting to here. Women may fall when there's no strength in men. What he's talking about here is something that we've forgotten in today's day and age. It is so easy when we have times of plenty, when we have times of security. There's an old idiom that says the only thing that needs for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. That is that same idea here. When they're talking about women are going to be at risk when men don't have the strength, whether it is internal strength or physical strength, to defend them. We're talking about a situation where women are going to be at risk. And this is something that we need to keep in mind in our own lives, not just in our writing, when we're talking about the type of people that we want to be. As men, do I have an internal strength to do the right thing? Am I putting other people at risk because I refuse to do the things that I know I ought to be doing? These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire and powder. What they're talking about here when he's talking about violent delights, there's a phrase that I've heard a writer talk about. It is, hate is the devil's cocaine. It makes you feel like you have the truth, that you have the right ends, you have a righteous anger, that you are the one in the right. But in the end, even if you are right, it can have a violent end, because if that other person thinks that they are right, then they are going to be fighting you with the same passion that you have, the passion that ends up destroying the people who hold it. You cannot grab a hot piece of iron and not expect it to destroy you. There's a passion that destroys, and there's a passion that builds. And there's kind of like a duality that's seen between the two of them in the story. It's not necessarily talked about that passion, that destroying passion of hate. It's more focused on the love, because love, as they say, triumphs over all. In the end, love is what brings us out of the fires and the hell that we create for ourselves in our passions of hate. And in their triumph die like fire and powder. What they're talking about powder here is gunpowder. You know, when we're talking about a fiery explosion, when we're talking about a destruction of everything that goes on, that's what's going on here. That's the imagery that Shakespeare's talking about. O true apothecary, thy drugs are quick. Thus with a kiss I die. This is at the end. After Romeo has been banished, there's a scene where Juliet's parents are trying to get her to marry somebody else. But because of the fact that Romeo and Juliet got married secretly, that there is a danger that she's going to be forced to marry this other person. And so she ends up trying to fake her death, fake a suicide. Now, because of circumstances beyond their control, there was supposed to be a message sent to Romeo that never got to him, because the friar had sent a messenger, but that messenger got waylaid in a plague house. So, in his distraught, that downside of that passion of love, is when it's torn up by its roots, when it loses its fuel, as it were. If we look at passion as like a fire, when we remove the fuel for that fire, it dies really, really quickly. And that's the same thing that the heart does, is when it is lost its love or its sense of what is right in the world, it dies. That soul begins to die. And so what ends up happening in the story is that Romeo took a poison and said, thy drugs are quick, recognizing that he is going to die really soon. And he wants his last act on earth to be a shared kiss with Juliet, who, unbeknownst to him, is still alive, though in a deep sleep because of what she took. I defy you, stars. Now this happens a little bit earlier, but what's he saying here? Stars have always been seen as a guiding way, something immutable, something that we can track our path on. Some would say that our destinies are written in the stars, that we can see how things are going to play out, that there is a path that the stars show us. Fate is another way of thinking about this. When he says, I defy you, stars, he's saying, I defy you, fate. I take everything that you've given me and I throw it back in your face. That's that pain that's Romeo's going through here. This is what we have for the scene when we're talking about how much the death of Juliet is affecting him, that he is shaking off not just the reality of the situation, but fighting off reality as a whole. He is declared that reality is trash, and the only way that he can resolve this is by killing himself. This is Juliet soon after that Romeo has killed himself. Oh, happy dagger, this is thy sheath. There be rust, and let me die. What she's saying here, right before she kills herself with the dagger, there be rust, destruction. One of the things that people don't realize is that blood is one of those things that actually destroys steel or iron rapidly. Because of the oxygen in our blood, if you don't clean off the weapon, the sword or dagger, you actually end up getting rust on the weapon, and it actually begins to fall apart pretty rapidly. This is thy sheath. My body is your sheath. There be rust. There be destruction. Let me die. This is one of the saddest endings for two star-crossed lovers, and something that we know almost intrinsically when it comes to how we expect love to play out. For us, we see love as something that doesn't end, I think that's natural. As a Christian, I believe that that's how we were originally designed, where love wasn't supposed to end, that there's a incongruity to how we see love to be everlasting. But because of the reality of the world we're in, that's just not the case. There be rust, there be destruction, and let me die. Giving up on potential happiness because without the person that you love, there is nothing more. Going to be haunted by what could have been for the rest of your life. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. It's the last line of the play. Here we're talking about how there was such joy, such passion, but because of circumstances, because of fate, that what could have been a blessing for everybody around them, a healing of the rift, a healing of the pains that others had caused. And the prince in this story had his kinsman killed. The prince is somebody who has been affected by this, but he knows that there was life and love, that after he's told the whole story, that this is a tragedy, that passion of hate, passion of destruction overcame the passion of love, that there sometimes isn't any happy ending. There's a reason why this is considered a tragedy and not a love story. On one hand, the tragedy is that love should win out the day, but that's not what happened here. The hate, the anger, inability to think through things with wisdom, that's what destroyed Romeo and Juliet. So when we're telling our stories, we need to think about how our readers are going to be receiving them. How deep are the emotions that you are trying to portray on the page? How much beyond the veneer of the words? If they keep digging underneath that topsoil, are they going to find more meaning under it, or are they going to find nothing? For you as a writer, that's how you need to be thinking about this. I just went over a few lines, talked a little bit about William Shakespeare, but you can find his William Shakespeare's plays anywhere. I'll be linking Project Gutenberg in the description below. So I highly encourage you to take a look at it. Try to glean as much as you can from the story. As always, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, please leave them in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.